Tom, you're very well known for your work on the morality of capitalism and for spreading the free market message far and wide in the far-flung corners of the globe. But how difficult is that, spreading that message right now at a time of such cynicism about, say, bankers and business and multinationals?
Well, I don't think it's particularly harder than it has been in the past, because people have been cynical about the motives of business people ever since Adam Smith. He was one of the most cynical of them all. He said, never do tradesmen gather except that the conversation turns to some conspiracy against the public interest. What normally happens, of course, is that they conspire, to the extent that they do, to get government to eliminate competition, to give them special favors, subsidies, restrictions on competitors, and so on. That's been around for a very, very long time. And so there's always scandals, unethical behavior on the part of business, and cronyism. Cronyism is a big deal. And in my opinion, the good news is more people are focusing on cronyism as a problem rather than blaming it on ethical business people. There is a big distinction between ethical business and cronyism and corruption.
The ethics of business, of course, coming into play right now with Dieselgate. What do you think of the impact of VW's dishonesty? Has that fueled the critics, if you'll excuse the pun, that it really does allow them to criticise business in a big way?
I'm not so sure. I mean, what we found in this case was a clear act of disobeying the law, and it's fraud against customers. You bought a vehicle thinking that it was meeting the emission standards, and it didn't. They were deceiving the regulatory authorities. What's interesting is that they had been required by regulation to do two things that turns out they're hard to do or maybe not possible. On the one hand, fuel efficiency standards, and on the other hand, reduction of emissions in CO2 and nitrous oxide. And they fudged it by lying to everybody, and they got caught. What's interesting is they got caught in the United States. Europe has been rather different. In Europe, this big push for diesel, all kinds of subsidies, lower taxes on diesel in comparison to petrol and so on. That didn't happen in the US, where diesel is not very favored. It's a very tiny niche market, about 1% of vehicles, and that's where they got caught. In Europe, I think more people were aware of this, but the regulators were giving them a wink and a nod because they had made a previous commitment in favor of diesel. And I think that is one of the root problems. The other is, of course, just rank dishonesty on the part of the executives.
But that will almost inevitably lead to a clamour. We're seeing it now for more regulation. Do you see that as the answer?
Well, it depends on what we mean by regulation, because it may be the answer. There are no unregulated markets. This is a myth that you're for regulation or against regulation. The question is, how is it regulated? Regulated means to be made regular. And that's what the rule of law is about. The rule of law is what regulates markets. Liability and contracts, you can't cheat and lie to people and so on. As opposed to what is sometimes called regulation. The term has come to mean arbitrary, unpredictable intervention into voluntary exchanges between people. That's actually the opposite of regulation, because it's often unpredictable. These are not open and transparent processes, and that's why you end up with a lot of cronyism. A great deal of what is called regulation today is not making markets regular, but irregular by giving special favors to those people who have access to power. So I do favor regulated markets, markets regulated by the rule of law. And that's what I think we need more of, more openness, more transparency, more rule of law, and less discretionary power on the part of bureaucrats, whether they're in Brussels or here in London or Washington, D.C. Those people are operating in a way that is remarkably non-transparent. And I think transparent, traditional British common law is a remarkably transparent mechanism that generates legal certainty. That's what people need in markets.
And you're working on a book on regulation right now. Perhaps you could tell us a little more about that.
This is actually something a little bit different. We normally think of regulation of the economy. This is about self-regulation. The title of the book is State Control or Self-Control. And it's about what happens when the state denies your freedom or your responsibility. It turns out those two are very closely knit together. You can't grasp one without the other. It's an unstable thing to want freedom without responsibility or responsibility without freedom. So when the nanny state comes in and tells us how we will behave, remove our freedom, people don't develop habits of responsibility as a consequence. And we see this in prohibition or the nanny state legislation, but even in the welfare state as well, where people save less, take less care for their future because the government's going to handle it for me. That's the state's responsibility. So that's what the book is about. And it's about the idea of the self-governing individual who bears responsibility for his or her acts and has the freedom to make choices governing themselves. And I fear that people of my generation have given too much of that up, but I'm hopeful about younger people. I think that we are seeing a much more responsible generation emerging in the United Kingdom, in North America, of people who say we want to make choices about our own future and we want to bear the responsibility for them. So I'm quite optimistic about this, but the book is full of techniques for achieving self-control. Turns out the Victorians were onto something. Self-control and self-discipline is something that one can cultivate and learn. And it's a good thing for a free society when people adopt those good habits of thrift and economy and thinking about the future and the long term and so on. So this is a long-term investment in the future of a free society to help people to cultivate the habits of self-regulation rather than looking to the government to control us.
Now, you do travel the world spreading this message. How are you finding that? And you've already hinted that there's a degree of optimism, but how do you see the future playing out?
I'm generally an optimist about liberty around the world. We always think about the negative things that are in the news, the horrors, Islamic State in Syria. There's just blood-curdling and terrible. Those are what get our attention. But if you look at the trend around the world over the long run, it's generally quite positive. More people experiencing more freedom, less violence and coercion in their lives. And I think that what is exciting for me is to see a global movement of people who, to use a simple expression, they get it. They understand the importance of freedom. They understand the importance of freedom of trade for developing prosperous, socially progressive societies. And so that global emergence of classical liberalism, where we have books that appear in Chinese and then in English, it's not just the other way around. These texts coming about in Arabic and Russian and Chinese and Portuguese and Spanish and Bahasa and Vietnamese. To me, this is a really exciting time to be alive because the classical liberal or freedom message is really expanding around the world. I was in Bali in Indonesia not too long ago, and the majority of the participants at a conference there were Chinese, Indonesian, Malaysian, Indian, Pakistani. The European participants were a very small minority of this global conference on the ideas of freedom. And we had all these participants from China talking about ideas that were identifiable with Adam Smith and James Madison and Jean-Baptiste Say and all these pioneers. But they read about them in Chinese or Bahasa.
That sounds to me like a suitably optimistic point on which to end.
I'm very optimistic about the future, and I'm grateful to the IEA for making a lot of that possible also.
That's terrific. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.